Welcome back to Grim and Whim. I'm going to put a trigger warning right at the start of the video, as this video will discuss topics such as human remains, dismemberment, and the murder of a child, which is never an easy topic to discuss. So if you aren't in the headspace for this today, please be kind to your mind, and I will see you in the next episode. In today's episode, we are going to be looking at the horrific murder of 8-year-old Alma Kellner, who disappeared from St. John's Church in Louisville, Kentucky in the year 1909. Her remains were later found about 4 months after she mysteriously disappeared, and the news of this young girl's murder absolutely rocked and horrified the city. And to this day, we still don't have an exact answer about who killed this little girl and what exactly happened that day. So let's go ahead and get into this story and see how the investigation played out and where the case is today. Alma Catherine Kellner was born in 1901 in Louisville, Kentucky, to her parents, Frederick and Florence Kellner. She was described as a bright and adventurous little girl, as well as a model student and a child of great promise, according to one of the Catholic nuns who worked with Alma at the school that she attended. Alma attended St. Mary's Academy on East Broadway. According to Sister Mary Genevieve, Alma would often steal away from the other children and go to the chapel to spend a moment in prayer. She was apparently a very devoted child and had a very loving disposition. She loved her church and her family and her friends, and of course, she loved God and her faith. It seemed that her life was starting off on a pretty good note, but sadly, her life was cut way too short by the hands of a killer. On the day she disappeared, Alma's mother and aunt attended early mass at St. Boniface Church, and this was the church that they usually attended. However, if they were running late or had other obligations that day, they would opt for St. John's Church instead. On the morning of December 8th, 1909, Alma stayed at home with her baby brother, and she was taking care of him and just being a big sister, and she told her mother that she would attend a later mass at St. John's. St. John's Church was so close to the Kellner home that they could actually see the church's spire from their front door. It was only a few blocks away. When her mother and her aunt returned home, they helped Alma get ready for church. Alma put on her Sunday best, which was one of her favorite plaid dresses. It was cream, tan, and brown with green and rose stripes. There were also pearl buttons and a green collar. Since it was a pretty cold December day, she also wore warm black stockings, her button-up shoes, a red cap, and her favorite black and white peacoat. Alma's mother watched as her daughter walked by herself towards St. John's Church at around 9:45 that morning. This would be the last time that her mother or anyone would have seen her alive. It's important to remember that these were very different times, and children were not as heavily supervised as they are today. In 1909, it wouldn't have been uncommon for a child of 8 years old to walk to a church, attend mass, and then walk home unaccompanied, especially because the church was only a few blocks away. And this was something that Alma had done before, and so it wasn't something that was unexpected or random. It was very much a part of their family's routine. And she was an adventurous little girl and very independent, and she was also very much a responsible child. And so when Alma didn't return that day, it was initially believed that maybe she was kidnapped and held for ransom. And This wasn't outside the realm of possibility because Alma's grandparents were actually quite wealthy. And so, if someone wanted to try to get a ransom, they probably would have made quite a bit of money. However, no ransom demands were ever made. And her family was obviously incredibly distressed, but the situation was about to become a whole lot worse. On May 30th, 1910, about 6 months after Alma had disappeared, her dismembered body was discovered in the cellar of the St. John's Church. Her body was found by a plumber who had been in the basement of the church to tend to a leaky water pipe that had been flooding the basement. And whoever had murdered her really didn't do too much of a great job with covering up her remains. The killer had done a rude attempt of burying her, and it was also evident that they had tried to dispose of Alma's body by setting it on fire and trying to burn the remains. And this next section is especially gruesome, so I wanted to prepare you before going forward. According to the coroner, her skull was crushed and nearly every bone in her body was broken and charred. The coroner said it was evident that the body had been packed into some kind of stove, and the body wasn't in the fire too long because the bones weren't as charred as they could have been, and also there was still flesh attached to the bones. And so it seems like maybe the murderer tried to dispose of her body by trying to burn it, but maybe realized it would have taken too long and wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. And so it seems that they did try to burn her body, but it wasn't in the stove for a long enough time to really get rid of her remains. It is absolutely horrifying, and I just can't even imagine the pain and terror that this little girl endured, and in a place where she felt safe, and this was like her home away from home. She loved going to church, and so it just really breaks my heart, one, that this little girl was murdered in the first place, but also the fact that she was murdered and just so crudely left to be found in this basement of a place that she adored, going to church. And so it just really breaks my heart knowing that her final moments were filled with so much terror and dread. And it just takes my breath away. I can't even imagine what she went through. The discovery of Alma Kellner's body made national headlines, and it sparked a nationwide manhunt for her killer. The police were initially looking into a man named Joseph Wendling, who was originally from France and was a janitor at St. John's Church, and he mysteriously vanished a month after Alma's disappearance. Now, him leaving town didn't initially arouse any suspicion, but when Alma's body had been found, obviously the police made the connection that he was likely the prime suspect in her murder. Joseph was eventually apprehended in San Francisco, and he was brought back to Louisville, where he was tried, convicted, and then ultimately sentenced to life in prison for her murder. However, he was paroled nearly 24 years later and returned to France and went about his life. Although Joseph Wendling was tried and convicted of her murder, there was speculation that Joseph may have not been the person who actually murdered Alma. Many people believe that Joseph Wendling was wrongfully convicted, and there are a couple reasons why. First, Joseph was convicted due to a large amount of circumstantial evidence. There really wasn't any physical evidence that placed him at the scene of the crime. And really, they were basically just going off the fact that, well, he left a month after Alma had disappeared, and that did seem very suspicious. But secondly, there was also some speculation that maybe Alma had been a victim of Hans B. Schmidt, otherwise known as the Killer Priest. So, Hans B. Schmidt was a German Catholic priest, and I'm honestly considering devoting an entire episode about him and his atrocities. He was an absolutely devious and just awful human being. This killer priest was a rapist, a convicted murderer, and a suspected serial killer. He was executed at Sing Sing Prison in New York State for murdering and dismembering a pregnant woman in the United States. He actually became the first priest in American history to be executed by electric chair. And apparently, he was visiting another church in Louisville from August 1909 to March 1910. This would have been within the time frame of Alma's murder. However, before his death, he did deny any connection with the murder of Alma Kellner. So now we are over 120 years since Alma was murdered, and we really don't 100% know who killed her and why. We have a verdict that remains questionable to this day, being Joseph Wendling and his trial. There was a lack of really any evidence, and the evidence that they did have was largely circumstantial. And him leaving town is very suspicious, especially considering he left town only a month after Alma had disappeared, and Joseph did work at the church where she was murdered. There really isn't any other evidence that suggests that he had any sort of motive to kill her or the means to kill her. And obviously, it being back in 1909, it was a little bit more difficult to collect and evaluate any sort of DNA evidence. And there really isn't a lot of evidence in this case, and that's what makes it really tricky. Yes, they did have a trial and they did come to a verdict, but I do wonder if this trial, if it were happening today, would they have actually convicted Joseph? Because with there primarily being only circumstantial evidence, is there enough to, without a doubt, say that yes, he killed Alma Kellner? I really don't think it would have stood. I don't think that his conviction would have actually happened if it happened today. That being said, him being a janitor and having probably more access to the cellar, that definitely does make it a possibility that he could have, lured her down to the basement and perhaps killed her. And he would have probably been the only person down there, at least for a while. In the research that I did, it didn't really say whether or not anyone else had access to the cellar or if this was primarily, just maintenance workers and janitorial staff, or if the door was left unlocked. It's sort of hard to say, but we can speculate. If the door was locked and access was fairly limited to just a handful of people, that would definitely narrow down the search, and it would make more sense that Joseph Wendling would be one of those prime suspects, him being the janitor and having access to that space. But once again, it is sort of speculative because we don't know whether or not the door was, locked, or if anyone could have made their way down there and, done what they had done to Alma. On the other hand, with Alma loving church, it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility that she could have been lured to the basement by someone like the killer priest. While she may not have been comfortable going somewhere with a stranger, a priest would have been a person in a position of power and a type of person that she may have easily trusted, like a police officer or a nun. I feel like a priest is someone that, because she loves church, she would have been more open to following that person somewhere. Whereas if it was just a total stranger, she may not have been as easily lured. However, we don't know if this killer priest was actually ever at St. John's Church where her body was found. We know that he was in Louisville, Kentucky, visiting another church at the same time frame of her murder. So is it a possibility that he could have visited St. John's Church or had just been passing by and seen, this little girl walking to the church by herself and was like, here's an opportunity? It is possible. However, with this event taking place over 120 years ago, we may never know who actually committed this murder. And this killer priest did, on his deathbed, he did not ever claim to have anything to do with Alma. And so it's really uncertain whether or not he was lying and he did have something to do with it, or maybe he was telling the truth and he really wasn't there that day and had nothing to do with it. There is also another possibility that it wasn't Hans B. Schmidt, the killer priest, or Joseph Wendling, the janitor who worked at the church. It could have been a complete stranger. Or maybe it was somebody who worked at the church, a nun, a priest, or it could have been somebody who was in the congregation. Maybe there was somebody in the congregation who had ill intentions and lured Alma down to the basement and murdered her. And I do think that if it was somebody that she recognized in the congregation, that maybe she would have willingly went down to the cellar with them. I'm just thinking back to my childhood. I grew up going to church, and if an adult asked me to do something, it was kind of just expected as a child that you follow their direction. So if somebody had said, hey, I need your help with something in the basement, I need to bring something up, or I need you to help me with something in the basement, I would have probably been like, okay, and not really have asked many questions just because, oh, this is a person at church, and I may have blindly trusted them. And this could have been the case with Alma as well. She was a very sweet little girl. She had a very loving disposition. It is very possible that somebody at this church, either a nun or a priest or simply a person in the church's congregation, could have taken advantage of Alma and her kindness. But with all that being said, I hope that you enjoyed listening to this story, and well, we may never know who took the life of this innocent 8-year-old. I do hope that we find answers one day, and if nothing else, that we learn from this story keep your eyes on your children and teach them about stranger danger. And even in places where they may feel safe and comfortable, it's always important to have those types of conversations about trusting adults and being mindful of your surroundings. And of course, this was, over 120 years ago. It was a very, very different time. I don't know if adults were really having those types of conversations with children, but we can learn from this tragedy and apply it to life nowadays. And so I hope you enjoyed listening to the story. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for joining me. It's goodbye for now, but I hope to haunt you again soon.